This one's got discontinued a while back, didn't it?
Yeah, and I used my iFixit tool to get that one fixed.
Yeah.
It works great.
Oh yeah, they're good stuff, but I mean, company ran out of money. All right, so just in time. It just started.
Come on, man.
Down something down the back right there. Everybody gets situated. All right. Welcome, everyone, to learn about the Migrate module, which is both wonderful and kind of complex. So, if none of this makes sense, feel free to stop me. But because the Migrate module is kind of disjointed and circular, but also really well put together, it takes a bit of explaining to make sure you understand exactly what's going on. So the main bit, go to the project page, because the documentation is very, very robust. It's actually one of the betterly documented projects on Drupal.org, in my opinion. But so we're going to dive right into how Migrate is laid out. Everything in the Migrate module is object-oriented. It has some standard hooks that you can get into, and it uses the Migrate API files to do the guts of its work. But most everything is class-based. So you've got this overarching migration class, which handles the take one thing, put it into another thing. And then there are 3 other classes that do help inside of that. So there's the Migrate source class, which is basically, this is a representation of the source data. You tell it how to get to the source data, what to connect to, and how to map everything on that class. There's the Migrate map table class, which essentially just manages a Migrate map table. So if you were to open up the database, you'd see a migrate underscore map underscore the name of whatever your migration is. We'll get to that in a minute. But the map table, or the map class, basically says keep a reference of the original source and where I put it, so that you can then do updates on it later. And the migrate destination is the bit of where you're migrating into. This is something like migrate destination node, migrate destination term, migrate destination whatever. So that's pretty much what I just said. Now there's a migrate field mapping class, which is just a wrapper around. So how many people have used Migrate? I should ask first. Okay, so anybody that's looked at it barely, this is the this add field mapping. So anytime you add a field mapping, what that actually does is get a singleton copy of the Migrate field mapping class, and this holds everything of map this field to this field. So say map username to the Drupal name, map title to title, that kind of thing. Hook Migrate API is basically where all statically defined migrations need to go. As of Migrate 2.5, it would automatically look through your class definitions and find any migrations that you needed to run. That's not true anymore. You have to define them explicitly. And I've got an example of this on the next page. So basically all Hook Migrate API is you return a structured array. So there are only a couple of things in there, like the API, that's always going to be set to 2. There's a set of groups, which logically gathers your migration data together with one another, and I'll show a live example of how that works here in a minute. And then your migrations array, which basically just says, these are the migrations I've written, this is what they're called, this is how you get data into them, and whatnot. So in order to actually write a migration, so say I want to take data out of FooCMS and get it into Drupal. I have to write a migration class for each type of data that I want to get out of FooCMS and into Drupal. So say I have foo users. I would write a foo user migration class that extends from migration. Inside of its constructor, I have to set up a whole bunch of things. I have to set up where does FooCMS's data live? How do I get to it? That's the source class, migrate source. I have to say, where are these going? So in the case of foo user, I would have a new migrate destination user set to this destination. And then I need to set up the map class, which is, for ease of use, it's usually migrate SQL map. There are 2 other maps, and I've honestly never used either one of them. So usually it's Migrate SQL map, and that just handles the, I've taken foo CMS user ID 12 and I've mapped it to Drupal UID 72, whatever. So we'll talk about the source class real quick. So Migrate source SQL is generally, sorry?
Back up a second.
Backing up a second.
User 12 to 70, you got those kinds of mappings so that they don't have to be the same keys on both sides?
Right.
Keep talking. I like it.
So yeah, I'll explain about that right now. Might as well, because I don't actually talk about the map table. Basically, whenever you run a migration, if you have a primary key which you've defined in your map, and I'll show you what that actually looks like when we get to the code portion of this, it will say, okay, I know that there's a primary key on the source side, and I know that the migration destination will give me a primary key back. So whenever it does the actual inserting into Drupal bit, it says, okay, I know that this ID was 12 over here, and now I just created user ID 72 here. Store both of those in the map table so I know that source ID 12 maps to source ID, or destination ID 72.
So if there's been an update to 12 later, it still gets pushed into 72.
Yep.
Woohoo!
You can also tell it to forcibly override all of that stuff. And also it's for, so say you update your source database later and add more users, but nothing else has changed, that tells Migrate which ones it's already done. So it doesn't need to worry about,
Right.
oh, I've got 12 more I need to do, I don't need to rerun the whole thing. So on the source side of things, we've got the Migrate source SQL class, which is the, and they moved us again. So Migrate source SQL is the most, well, maybe not most common source, but it's the easiest one to work with. There are a bunch of different Migrate sources you can deal with, like Migrate source CSV or Migrate source XML. It just basically says, what kind of source data do I have? So say you've got foo CMS is in a MySQL database. You would use Migrate source SQL to say, okay, foo CMS is in a database that I can get access to. Basically all it does is it's a wrapper around Drupal's database select API. So if you do a DB select, that's really all that does. You pass it a query for that. So it will automatically get a count based on that query using Drupal's count query on the select class. If you ever dug into the source, basically all that does is it wraps a count around your query. That can be slow because that's not necessarily efficient. It usually is, but sometimes not. So you can also pass it an explicit count query. So you can say, instead of trying to do the standard query, just use this one instead. One of the gotchas is, by default, Drupal uses PHP buffered queries, which means you have to stream the entire result set to the client before it will actually start processing anything. So if you've got a large result set of, say, like 3 million things that you need to migrate, you have to wait until all the data is transmitted before it actually starts doing any kind of migration. And that's true of any SQL select inside of Drupal. And it's actually really hard to get around. You can get at it and change it to an unbuffered query, but that works with all kinds of other things because generally it's trying to do more than one query at once.
Can you get it to do it in chunks? You know,
Yeah, you can.
10,000 at a time?
On Migrate, you can specify -- limit,
Right.
and it will just do however many you specify. And you can even set a limit on time. So you can say run this migration for 90 seconds or whatever.
Does the limit allow you to give it a start and count as well as just a count?
Not really, but it'll go based off of what's in the map table. So it'll look and see the last thing that it did, but it doesn't do that to the query. So like it doesn't tack on a start at this ID unless you explicitly pass an ID list.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, and usually you need to, the easiest way to deal with this is having another entry in settings.php for the source database. You can pass a whole bunch of options to Migrate source SQL, but really only 2 of them are particularly important. Map joinable says whether or not you can actually do a SQL join across your source and destination databases, which usually requires them to be on the same server, and the user has to have access to both of them. Usually it's false.
I was going to say. I hope it defaults to that.
It defaults to false. But if you do happen to be able to make a join, it can do a join across to figure out which ones it hasn't done yet. So it's a lot faster that way. But if map joinable is turned off, basically what it has to do is it has to scan through everything in its map table and say, have I done this yet? No. Have I done this yet? Essentially. And then cache counts is just whenever it does its migrate status call, it has to figure out how many things it needs to import for every migration you've defined. If you have big migrations, that takes a while sometimes. So caching counts stores that in Drupal's cache, wherever you've defined it, usually the database. And so next time you run status, it runs a lot faster because it's got the counts cache. But you do have to clear them if you update your source data. We'll talk a little bit about migrate source XML, which is honestly kind of hard to deal with. But you can do it in multiple ways. So say you have one file with multiple items. All you need to do is use migrate source XML and give it an XPath to the items. So say you've got in standard XML like an items tag that contains item. All you have to do is give it an XPath path to whatever that item is. And then it's like, oh, okay, I'll use that as the source. And then every time you do a migrate field mapping, you would use XPath to tell it what the XPath relative to that item is. And then if all else fails, there's Drupal.org node 220297113, which I don't expect you to remember. But that's the, oh God, I'm trying to migrate XML, what the hell do I do?
And it's nothing but a page with a big phone number on it.
Pretty much. It's got several suggestions. It can get kind of hairy because, say you have multiple, actually I talk about that in a little bit, so we'll get to that later. So migrate destination is pretty great because all of the destinations have their own fields which will map for you, and in Migrate 2.6 there's a nice UI that says these are the fields that are available, how would you like to map them? So each one of these is different and set up in the destination class. So migrate destination node says, okay, I know I'm a node. Here are these fields that I, by default, provide. I know I have a title field. I know I have a UID field of who created it. I know I have a created date and an updated, which has changed. And then other modules can hook into that destination and say, add things onto it. So like migrate redirects is a redirect, so the redirect module has a redirects destination handler that says, okay, anytime I have an entity that can handle a redirect, I want you to tell migrate that I've got this extra field that they can specify as a migration, or as a mapping class, and then I will go ahead and create a redirect for it as part of the migration instead of you having to handle it. And taxonomy does that too, I think, by default, and then there are a couple of other ones. I can show you that in a little bit. And so we do have classes for all the core Drupal features so far, and Migrate Extras has a whole bunch of extra types like organic groups and private message support, and then there are a couple of scattered other ones in various places. But the vast majority of what you need if you're doing migration is either going to be in Migrate Core or in Migrate Extras, which is provided with Migrate. Okay, so briefly let's talk about how you deal with malformed data. There are 3 things you can do to deal with data that is bad on the source end. Every migration class can implement any of these 3 methods. So back to our foo user migration example. I can define a method on foo user migrations class called prepare row. When migrate is running, every time it's trying to import a single row, it will check to see if this method exists on the migration class. If it does, it will call it and pass row by reference. Oh well, standard PHP by reference of objects. So you can manipulate the row object and change things inside of it. So, for example, if I have the title needs to be HTML entity encoded, all I have to do is say row title equals HTML entities row title. You can do the same thing with the prepare method, but that's been called after the destination's been populated. So migrate goes through a bunch of different steps. First, it pulls the source data out. Then it passes it to prepare row and says, hey, fix this. Then it passes it to apply mappings, which happens in the background. You don't ever have to mess with it. But what it does is it takes whatever destination that it needs to be, puts an object together with that destination. So say we're doing a user. It would create a new standard class. It would set the user's username, email address, everything that I've mapped so far as a standard class. And then it will pass it to prepare. as that first entity did. So after all of that's been populated, I can check the entity to make sure everything's been populated correctly, or do anything that I need to do after that's already happened, because that happens after some hooks have run. But for the most part, you can get away with prepare row. And then the last one is add field mapping callbacks. So when you're defining a field mapping, you can say, hey, when you do this map, I want you to call these functions. And that pretty much operates the same as prepare row, except you can have it in encapsulated methods. And it's a little bit cleaner that way. But functionally, these are all pretty equivalent. They just happen in different points of migration. So oftentimes you will have migrations that are dependent upon one another. Any well-structured CMS requires you to have a user first before you can create something, right? So say I have a foo blog post migration. And foo blog posts have a user ID referencing the user. I have to do the user migration before I can successfully do the blog post migration, because I won't know who these blogs are mapped to unless I've done that already. Unless, of course, you want to just map them to admin or whatever. So what you do in this case is when you create the foo blog post migration class, you would tell it that this dependency is machine name of my original dependency. So like that would be the foo user dependency. Migrate will automatically sort all of your migrations and say, this is the order in which they need to run. If you try to run one out of order, it will warn you and say, this other migration depends on another migration. Do you really want to do this? Pass -- force if you do. Otherwise, run this other one first. So, and it does that by checking to see if the number of total records equals the number of imported records or is greater. And if not, it won't let you do it unless you force it. You can also set up dependencies in the Migrate 2.6 interface. There were some bugs around that recently, but I think we've got all of them worked out. But it is highly recommended that you use Drush to do all this because it's way faster and not quite as clunky. Primarily, you can use Drush to like put tasks in the background and whatnot, which some of the things you can't do in the API. Although as of 2.6 and Drush, if you have Drush 6, you can tell the Migrate UI to use Drush's batch API instead of Drupal's default batch API, which works a little better. But anyway, there are some very useful commands you can use. Drush-ms shows the status of registered migrations. Drush-mi imports a migration. Drush-mr rolls back that migration. So a rollback basically says, okay, I've done the migration on all of these foo users, but I screwed up and I want to nuke what I've done. So I just say, drush-mr foo user. It'll go back and delete all the users that I've already created, wipe the records from the map table, and start it clean. This also works for reverse dependencies. So if you say roll back on the users, but I've already imported the blog posts, it says something to the tune of, hey, wait a minute. You can still do it, but it will leave you with orphan dependencies, which might screw stuff.
The MS, you're getting status. Does that mean that the other, is that just a status of everything that's been defined?
Yep.
It's not a status of currently running.
You can do it while it's running.
So you can go to a second screen and bring up an MS while because the first one's not thrown off into the background and just running. I mean, the drush command is sitting there.
Yeah, it's not by default, but you can send it to the background like
sure,
any other standard.
Sure.
But yeah, you could open up another terminal and say, migrate, give me the status, and it will tell you that this one is importing and this is how many it's done.
Very nice.
I haven't tried that.
Migrate is great. I can't thank Mike enough for this. So
who?
Mike Ryan. He is the principal architect of Migrate, along with Moshe, if any of you have ever encountered them. But no, they're great. It's really well architected. I can't thank them enough. It makes my life a lot easier. But there are a couple more commands. You can do drush NST, which is just stop the currently running migration. So if you've got one running in the background that's been running for a long time, you need to stop it for whatever reason, you should use that to stop it because it needs to do some cleanup after it's done. If you just Control-C kill it, you will get into a state where the migration thinks it's still running even though it's not. And that's what that next command is for, drush-mrs, which resets the migration to an idle state. Drush-maz is actually pretty cool. It does data analysis on the source data. Basically, it'll select a set number of rows and then do a quick analysis on it, like say, oh, all of these records are the same, so you probably don't need to worry about it. Or these are the potential ranges you can get, and I'll show you an example of that. And then drush migrate register anytime you define a new migration, and you've already defined migrations, you have to rerun migrate register in order for it to parse that API function again and say, okay, these are all the stuff. Because it caches all that in the database. Also, if you add additional parameters in that manner, you have to do another migrate register to clear the static cache. This is your migrate status command. So that's just showing the beer migration. Hasn't done anything yet. Last imported status, how many processed, etc. And then a couple of screenshots of migrate 6 or 2.6 UI, which I'll actually show you. So I'm just going to speed through those real fast. All right. So.
All right. Demo time.
Demo time indeed. All right. You want to start with the UI or the command line? Anybody care?
I like command line better than UI, but whatever.
I actually ditched the UI for the command line. It's way easier to work with.
Yes.
I guess that answers that question.
Well, there might be others here that would prefer the UI.
All right. So these are the migrations that I've got going. The biggest one we've got is the wine. These are included in migrate examples, so they can give you a quick tutorial of how these things work. And we'll run through the class structure here in a second, but I wanted to start with the command line. So I'm just going to worry about the beer migration right now. So if you pass the group parameter, it'll just show you one particular group, and this is why you group them into different things if you've got a bunch of source data coming in, because it's a lot easier to deal with. All right, so Drush MAZ is actually probably pretty cool. If I can type. Let's use the beer node. All right, so Drush MAZ just spits out, these are all of my source data. So BID is the numeric beer ID, and it tells me that I've got a numeric field with a range of 99997 into 99999. And then, so B name, I've got a string field with length running from 8 to 11, body, excerpt, aid, no idea what that is. But anyway,
You've
so it just,
got a very limited number of records for this. What happens if you've got 1 million records?
it'll do a limit.
Okay.
It just rattles off, I think it's first 1,000 or so, and then
Okay.
it runs the analysis on those. So, I mean, you always want to do actual data analysis on the source data if you can, but this is just a nice quick, okay, I've got 5 minutes, what does this look like? Do any fields look like they have empty values? Do any fields look like they have all of the same values, kind of thing?
Those are fields on the node, or
Those are fields on the
values from
source.
the content?
From the original content. So this is saying my source database, the beer CMS, we'll call it. This is what was in beer CMS's database. And I mean, it's the same thing for like beer term. By the way, my machine names are case insensitive, so you can type whatever you want.
How do you get a list of what these things are that you're passing?
The commands or?
The beer term and the...
Oh, okay, so those are defined. So, let's close. Here, PHP. All right. All right, so down here in this migrations array, this is the Migrate API, Quick Migrate API implementation.
Right.
Notice that this is in the .migrate.inc file. Migrate actually automatically looks for migrate.inc files. You don't actually have to do anything in the module. So if I open up Migrate examples module file, you'll notice there's nothing in it. Because there doesn't need
I love
to be
those
anything.
module files.
There can be things in it if you need us to do things. Then sure, whatever. But by default, that is completely empty, and you do all of your work inside of the migrate.inc file. And literally all migrate.inc is hook migrate API. And ultimately, all it needs to do is return an array, which is well structured. So here's the API version 2. Here are my two groups, beer and wine. And so inside of my migrations array, that's where I'm defining these things. So this is the machine name. So by default beer term. It maps to the class beer term migration, and it's part of group beer. And that's true of all of them.
So you could have done that Maz on beer term, beer user, beer node.
Or beer comment. And actually I can do it on all of the wine stuff too.
Sure.
I'm going to stick with beer because it's an easier example to follow.
You just like it to tickle your nose with the bubbles.
Yes. Whatever you say. All right, so beer.inc over here contains all of the migration classes. So here's class beer term migration. This is what does all of the guts of mapping things together. So most of the method is actually in the constructor, or rather most of the implementations in the constructor. I hate the resolution on this, but you guys can see this, right?
Yeah.
I forgot to ask, sorry. Anyway, so you just call the parent constructor, because this ultimately extends from migration. It's usually a good idea to write a interstitial class in between them. So we've got basic example migration, which does a couple of like real quick setup things in its constructor, like it sets this team. That shows up in Migrate UI. I'll show you that in a minute. But anyway, so ultimately you call parent constructor with arguments, and all of a sudden this arguments array is populated with whatever you send in the Migrate API. So for example, if I go over here to the beer term thing and I add Alex is awesome, I now have access to that inside of the beer term migration, inside of that'd be populated now with any parameter that I need. So generally you'd use that to pass things like the machine name of the user migration or something, because that's pretty common that you have to pass around with other stuff. Or you might set like the default format on a text field and define that in your Migrate API, so you don't have to worry about it in like 15 different classes. You can just set it up in here. You can also do that in the groups array. So doing that, moving this up to here would give everything that's in the beer group access to the Alex variable inside of the arguments array. Anytime you do something like this, though, you have to do a drush migrate register, otherwise it won't pick it up.
So another version of clear cache.
Pretty much. Or you actually can clear all caches, because I think it's stored in the cache table too. But migrate register.
CTFC.
Huh?
CTFC.
Migrate register is the go-to for that. But so, putting all the stuff that I was talking about into perspective, this query right here is just a Drupal select API call that says, this is the database table where beer topics, my beer terms come from. They come from the table migrate example beer topic. And I want you to get out all of these fields. Everybody's used the DB select API, right? Okay.
It doesn't look that difficult.
It's not. It's just an object-oriented representation of a query instead of just doing DB query. And so when you create migrate source SQL, you pass that query along, and that's how migrate knows where everything is coming from. So anytime migrate needs to figure out how many of these are there, or what's my source data look like, it uses that query object. It also bases its count on that query object by wrapping it in a count, essentially. So the destination is just migrate destination term. The destinations take different parameters based on what they are. Term destinations just takes the vocabulary name. So this is the machine name of the migrate example beer styles vocabulary. And then the last thing that you have to define is the, well, not technically the last, but anyway, the last class you need to define is the migrate map. Migrate SQL map takes 3 parameters. The first is always the machine name. You can pass a different name. This is what determines the name of the table that it creates. So it's always going to be migrate underscore map underscore that first parameter. Don't ever change it from machine name. It will make your life hell because you'll be looking for it later and like, what the hell did I name that? Blah, blah. The second parameter it takes is the Drupal database array syntax of the primary key of the source. So we've got this style is going to be our primary key for the mapping. It's a varchar. It's 255 characters. It's not null, and its description's topic ID. The last parameter is the SQL representation of the destination's primary key. Fortunately, every destination has this get key schema method, which defines that for you, so you don't actually need to know what it is. It's really nice. The next thing you have to do is map things to one another. So up here in my query, I've got things like style, detail, style, parent, region, hobbiness, etc. So now I have to say that, okay, I know style is probably the term name, so I want to add field mapping, map the name to the style. Description details, parent name, style, parent. So parent name on a term migration just says, there's a parent term with this name. I want you to make this term a child of it, if it's set. So it can automatically do your taxonomy term hierarchy for you, which is really cool and sometimes frustrating.
So parent underscore is magic?
Kind of. So in the term destination, it defines a bunch of these like kind of ephemeral things, one of which is parent, which is the parent term ID, and you can just pass it a parent term ID if you need to. But then there's also parent name, which says, okay, migration destination term, I need you to go find a term with this name in this vocabulary. So it does a, what is that, taxonomy term load by, no, it's taxonomy term load with the name parameter later.
Sure.
Basically just does a lookup. And then it gets that term ID for you. So, I mean, you can either specify parent name or parent or neither. So the next thing is, here's an example of something we don't even want to migrate, because we don't care about hobbiness. We're not implementing hobbiness in our new site. So we just say, add field mapping null hobbiness, give it a description of this is not going to be maintained in Drupal, or whatever you want. This is mostly for the benefit of whoever is coming after you to vet what you've done in your migration. If you're just doing it yourself, you don't even really have to worry about this, but it's a nice way to document it in the UI. And so the issue group is just a string. That's DNM, do not migrate.
If you had left it completely out,
Migrate would tell you that it's not mapped,
that's what I was.
but it wouldn't do anything.
Okay.
And actually, I'll show you that in the UI too, because it produces a cool little thing. Here's an example of informing a client, if you were doing this for a client, that they need to go look at something and tell you what the hell to do. Because I don't know what to do with region. We don't have a field for it right now. Do we need to add a field to the vocabulary for region? Let me set it to the issue of client issues. I give it a priority of medium, and I give it an issue number. Issue number is really not all that important, but but Migrate UI will show this in a group called client issues, and it will show that description. Theoretically flagging whoever you're working on this for to say, oh, we need to do da-da-da-da-da-da. And a bunch of other do not migrates. There's actually a shortcut for this now, which is this.
Those.
Add unmigrated destinations or sources. So you can just say, add unmigrated sources and pass it an array of the names of the fields you don't want to migrate. Instead of setting all of them manually to issue group DNM,
Sure.
it will do that for you automatically. And so he's doing the same thing here with Path and Path Auto. So Path Auto module does one of the same things I told you earlier. It modifies the destination entities and says, if this is an entity that can use Path Auto, I want you to add a migration field for Path Auto, so you can say, I want the Path Auto path to be this in my migration.
So you're checking to see if that has been done and saying, yeah, thanks, no, don't bother.
Right, so I guess now would be a good time to show you the Migrate UI so all of those make sense. It's in a little weird place because I wouldn't have expected it to be here. I kind of would have expected it to be under like configuration or something, or maybe reports, but it's under content and tab called Migrate. It will show you your groups, and you can run any of those commands from here. Don't, but you can. But the coolest bit is being able to drill down into here. So I've got this is the beer term migration we were just looking at. It tells me these are my destination fields. So this is everything that one of our terms can take. Term ID, name, description, parent name, those two I was talking about before you heard. Format, weight, and path. Those are everything that makes a term a term. And so Migrate knows that I've got all of these things that I can mess with while I'm doing my migration. I've got the source field, which is the same thing. It tells me the query that's running. And then it tells me all of the machine names of the fields. The description over here, by default, is just the name of the field. But if you explicitly define your fields, which you can do by passing that as the second parameter to Migrate source field, so I could do something like you can't type while I'm presenting. I don't know why.
It's that standing and typing thing.
You know, I had a stand-up desk for a really long time, and it was great.
Yeah, but it was a lot higher up than what you're doing right now.
That's true. So I can make a fields array and say define all of those explicitly, and that will wind up in the UI saying, okay, here are the fields, and now I've actually got descriptive descriptions. When I'm doing client work, I always do this, so if they happen to stumble upon that, they know exactly what they are. Not that I necessarily want them poking around in there, aside from the, I need help on this. Actually, I do want them poking around. Part of the thing about a migration is making sure that the client, who knows their own CMS, their previous CMS way better than I will, has actually looked at and vetted what we're doing. So, I mean, that's a really important part of it. But anyway, so here are these DNM and done things. DNM is just, we're not migrating these. Okay, cool. It'll tell you if it's destination or source, if you've given it a default value, description, priority, etc. Same thing with done. Anything that's been mapped, it will appear in this done field. And then we've got this mapping client issues, which we made at the bottom there, that says, okay, destination, source, default, description, priority. Priority, the issue number, by the way, which I said didn't really matter. It matters if you actually have a Drupal.org node ID for it. That's what that is, but that's why I say it doesn't really matter. All right, let's muck with this so I can show you what happens. Kind of wish I had this set up to where you would be. Let's get rid of that. Yeah. Always suitor. Always suitor. Alright, so I just deleted the mapping for description. If I refresh, now I've got one on map destination and one on map source, because I haven't actually done anything. This is the question you were talking about, Kurt. What happens if you don't do it? Well, Migrate will tell you in red that you have not mapped that field.
Okay.
If you run the migration, it won't care. But
at least it's giving you a heads up.
right, it's giving you a rather beat across the head, hey, you haven't dealt with this field. I don't know if that's intentional or not. But we'll put that back in. There's another thing we can do, which, oh yeah, I haven't shown you default values yet, have I? All right, so for any field mapping, you can do, if this is empty, set a default value, and that's pretty much just and that should show up in the UI. So, right there. And the description has a default one. All right, let's go ahead and run one of these. All right, so I just set run beer term with a limit of 1 item. You can set 2 different kinds of limits, timer limit, or actually I think there's a memory limit too, but I've never used it. So timer limit or item limit. By far more often you want to do a number of items, like especially if you're iterating through a migration trying to get something right. You can also pass ID lists. So if you do beer term like ID list equals, let's pick out beer term. No, I didn't know the equals. Never mind. But anyway. If you pass ID lists, you can specify the source ID or a comma-separated list of source IDs for it to try and migrate. If you do that and it already exists, it will just run an update. So, all right, so we've migrated one thing in. Let's go back here to migrate and look at our status. So it says I've got 3 beer terms, 1 imported, 2 unprocessed. My throughput is 2,308 a minute, which is pretty not bad. If I go over here to taxonomy into the migrate example beer styles, I now have this ale style, which didn't exist before. So let's go ahead and finish migrating. Created 2 more terms. Now I have red ale, which is a child of ale, and pilsner. But let's pretend I did something wrong. I just rolled back all 3 of those beer terms, and now they're all gone. So just cleaned up everything that I did. So another fun feature of Migrate is you can run an entire group of migrations at the same time. And it will cycle through them in order, doing them as fast as it can. So I just created all of my beer terms, all my users, all of my nodes, and all of my comments.
Nice.
Yep. Let me show you the database schema real quick. Most of the tables have something to do with migrate in their name. So it actually creates a decent number of them. 1 map for every migration you've got, 1 status table, period. And then there are a couple of other things that it needs to do. Those are just fields. Anyway, so let's take a look at the migrate. Oh, and a message table per thing. So if a message comes up in your migration, there's a drush MNSG command, which will show you any messages that popped up, like there was an error on this, or this value wasn't appropriately populated, or we couldn't flip array and string values because there's a bug in the freaking entity API.
Is that the message?
No. It's not actually a bug, it's you're passing something bad, but the error message isn't particularly clear on that issue. I think there's an issue queue item that says, hey, please make this an actual, you're passing something wrong error instead of, oh my god, I can't do this. But so if we So that's the migrate map beer term table. Basically all it says is my source ID was ale, my destination ID is term ID 4. That third column is whether it needs an update or not. So if you do drush mi -update, you mark everything in the table for needs update, and then it will run through and do a complete update on the results. Rollback action is just when it's doing rollback, that's how it tracks what it needs to do. Like delete or whatever, usually that gets to set to a 1 for delete. Last imported, if you have a high water field set, so there's a feature in Migrate that you can do, and I'll show you it basically. And it follows the same Drupal API stuff, so you can do this high water field equals array, basically that, and it will track that field and say, all right, so the last value I imported was timestamp 1777539 or whatever. Next time I run this query, I want to do where timestamp is greater than that. So it can kind of speed up your migrations quite a bit. But you have to be careful with the high water field because that precludes updating. If you do --update, it won't actually do anything because the query won't return anything to update because it's still checking on that high water field. You'd have to manually go into the migrate status table and wipe it. But I mean, it's very useful for things like, okay, I know when I get this, I got a data dump from the client 2 weeks ago, and I know they're going to have more users, but I think they're going to have more users that have been, like previous users that were updated that need to be updated. And they've got a date changed field. So I can set my high watermark to date changed. So the next time I get that source data in, it will just select on things that are greater than date changed, and I know if it's in that result set, I need to either update or import. But I don't need to do the rest of the result set. I like to write migrations without high water field set while I'm developing on them, and then afterwards I will add them before I actually do a real production migration. All right, and that's pretty much the gist of it. That hash table column right here is a cool new Migrate 2.6 feature, which if you pass, I'll just type it because it'll be easier, but I think it's track changes. I'll have to look at its actual name. But you can basically tell the migration to track changes, and every time it does a migration, it will hash the destination or the source data, and it will store it in this hash column right here. And so this can slow down your migrations, but if you don't have a high water field and you don't have a reliable way to check and see if the data's changed, and you don't actually want to rerun the full migration every time, you can set that field and it will compare the hash of the source to the hash it's got before it tries to do an update. The problem is it has to run through every row and do that to check and see if something's changed. You have any questions? I'm sure there are questions.
What did you say was in the migrate status table?
It's a list of all the machine names plus a couple of other bits of data. So that's actually not really bad. So it's just essentially machine name, the class name it's mapped to, what group it's in. The status field maps to idle, migrating.
And that's where your high water is at, okay.
Yep, and then high water stored right next to that. And then arguments. This is a serialized representation of
Of your dependencies.
well, Postgres, fine.
You weren't using it anyway.
I was actually using it. It's a representation of these parameters right here. Well, these two parameters are stored in the table directly, but any additional parameters, so if I were to do foobar and then rerun migrate register, it would show up right there.
So you've talked about migrate register, but you made a few changes in the code that were reflected immediately. So it's not something you have to do all the time?
No, it's only when you make a change to the hook migrate API stuff. So anytime you make a change in here, you have to do a migrate register, but otherwise you don't.
I see.
It'll pick up on dependencies automatically. Basically anything that happens inside of the migrate classes is fine, but anything that happens inside of here has to be registered. So if you're adding a new migration, you have to do migrate register or it won't pick up.
That seems pretty cool. So you said you've got MySQL as a source and XML and CSV.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds redundant on the CSV since I can do that through MySQL, but how would you migrate from like a Microsoft SQL?
So MS SQL is a bit harder, but you can get at it with the SQL drivers, so you use migrate source SQL. But you have to have the ODBC driver for MS Access or whatever installed on your server. So CSV is not necessarily redundant because you could import that directly into the database if you want to, but none of your hooks are going to run. So if you've got some kind of complicated setup on user save or whatever, or node save, running it through just updating the database is going to miss whatever those hooks do.
No, I meant you can you can reference MySQL tables as CSVs directly.
Yes, that's true.
I get lazy and do that from time to time.
Well, yeah, and working with CSV source classes is kind of a pain. My preference is to work with it in some form of SQL, just because it makes data analysis easier. But that's not your only option. You also have JSON. You can do so XML, CSV, JSON. Those are the big ones. There's also migrate source list, which is a wrapper around another source type. So say you've got a web API you need to migrate from, or whatever, and the web API has an ID at the end of it, like some kind of numerically keyed ID. You can use migrate source list to say, okay, I've got this list of IDs that I need you to run through, and here's how to get at it. And then you pass it a URL mask or whatever to the JSON thing, and it will just iterate over them every time. That's a little bit more complicated, but not too bad.
Is there any limitations that you've seen in terms of the complexity of an entity that you're trying to import?
Sure, if you have tons and tons of data. Well, in terms of mapping, it's not ever been too bad. But in terms of migration speed, there are lots of things that can slow you down. Like lots of rules that trigger during migration. A lot of the times you want to turn off most of the non-essential rules if you can get away with it.
That'd be destination rules.
Yeah. So if you do, actually this will help a little bit, I think. I can tie it. No
Just
problem.
like I can.
All right.
Instrument.
So if you do instrument, it'll tell you how long things are taking. Actually, let's just do. It didn't process anything, so. So that gives you a quick rundown of everything that it was trying to do. Comment save or node save or entity save or whatnot should be fairly close to the top. If you have like anything like prepare row near the top, you know that you've got a performance problem on your source end, like you're trying to crunch too much data, or you're running too many regexes on it, or you've got really slow queries that you're trying to avoid. Otherwise, if you have like, if comment save is like 5 times bigger than everything else, you know you've got a lot of rules or something that are triggering on that comment save that's taking up a good portion of your migration time. And then you have to tune accordingly. But yeah, a lot of the time it's been the destination has a lot of things that are running that don't necessarily need to be running, like tracking user loyalty or whatever. Kind of an important thing, but since I could be migrating it separately already, I don't need that to run while I'm doing all this content import, so I'll set up like a module implements alter or sorry, hook implements alter. Yeah, hook module implements alter, that's it. Or I'll do something like inside of my source class, I can set up a bit of SQL to disable rules from the database directly and re-enable them when I'm done. There's actually a documentation on the Migrate modules documentation on how to do that. So that's typically what I do. Another thing that you have to watch out for, especially if you have huge quantities of data, say like 10 million comments, if you try to do a query where you're pulling all of that comment data out like you normally would do on a migration, so like the beer term migrations query is just flat out, select everything out of the table and give me all of these fields. If you have too many rows to fit inside of PHP's memory, you can't do that. You have to basically pull out the primary key, because it's going to load the entire table's worth of primary keys. And then inside of prepare row, you have to go do another SQL call to get the rest of the fields that you want. So like you have to do a lookup by ID, because otherwise you're going to run out of memory. And there's no way around that, because there's not a way to tell Drupal's database API, please don't do this, I only want X number of rows. I mean, you can tack on a limit to the query, but Migrate doesn't really work like that, so that's a limitation you have to get around. But it doesn't usually become a problem unless you're doing like, this site's been around for 10 years and they have like 7 years worth of forum post data that you have to import, which I've done. So
Had to say that 10-year number, didn't you?
No question. So at what point can you compare this to other migration options like feeds, import, and things like that? And what are the pros and cons of those, and at what point would you need to or want to make the jump to something like the Migrate module?
okay, so Migrate's main downside is its learning curve, but it makes up for that in sheer power. You can literally control every aspect of what you're doing down to the millimeter. Like I can say, I've got this weird edge case that I need to deal with in Migrate. Inside of prepare row, I can check for it and deal with it. Peach can't really do that. You just basically say, okay, this needs to go here, this needs to go here, this needs to go here. I never did show you Migrate UI's managed fields, did I? No, that's not. So, I'm click edit over here, and here are all of the field mappings that I've got. And so I can set these via the UI. I don't ever do that, but you can.
So you don't have to write as much code as you've been writing?
No,
But,
not at all.
but to even get to that, you still have to have all your classes in place.
Classes have to be defined.
Right.
And the source data has to be defined, but you don't actually have to do the mappings. And actually, you don't even have to set up the dependencies because you can define them in the UI too. So the only thing you really have to do is set up the source, destination, and map classes. And then you get the nice pretty UI stuff that you deal with.
It's so much easier in the code.
Huh?
It's so much easier in the code because you have all the rest of the mappings around it, so it makes logical sense. And
Yep.
some of that doesn't work in the UI very well.
You're right. You're absolutely right.
I ran into a lot of that while I was using the Drupal to Drupal migration and the UI side of it, and I was like,